I'm going to do a quick video on removing the CV shafts from a 2003 to 2008 Mazda 6 with the 3.0 Duratec V6. I'll pause the video as I'm carrying out the steps, but I'll do it in sequence where I'll describe what I'm going to do. I'll pause the video and do it, and then I'll resume throughout the steps until the CV shaft is out. This is on the right side of the vehicle, but the process is the same for both sides. I've already removed the little plastic inner shield, and it's just a series of the little plastic pop rivets. The first thing we're going to do is disconnect the wheel speed sensor wire where it's mounted. It's mounted with a bolt here to the inner fender, and it's mounted to the upper steering arm, steering knuckle. So we're going to disconnect it right here, and then I'm also going to disconnect where the brake hose is mounted to the lower portion of the strut, and then that will give me room to access the upper end of this link here for your stabilizer bar. So, the stabilizer bar at the top end, the link mounts to your strut fork. And we're going to end up having to remove the strut fork to get the CV shaft out. So, remove the two bolts holding the wheel speed sensor wire, remove the bolt holding the brake hose to the strut tube, and then remove the nut holding the upper sway arm link to the strut fork. I'm going to do those steps, and then I'll proceed with the video. Okay, I got the bolt removed for the speed sensor wire retainer from the inner fender. I got the bolt removed for the speed sensor wire clip from the upper steering knuckle, and I got the nut removed from the stabilizer bar link. Inside the bolt from the top of the stabilizer bar link, there's a little slot for an 8mm Allen wrench, and that's so that you can hold the bolt in place while you take the nut off, because the shaft will actually spin. So it's difficult to get the bolt to stay still while you take the nut off. In my experience, the Allen key socket actually strips out unless this is a relatively new link on your stabilizer bar. So the other option is you can usually get in behind. There's actually a little shoulder on the back of this that you can clip onto with vice grips, and that will allow you to keep the shaft steady enough to get the nut off. You want to be careful you don't tear your boot, your grease boot here, with the vice grips. So now that those are off, I'm going to remove or at least disconnect the lower strut fork, and then I'm going to remove the wheel speed sensor, and then I'm going to take the upper ball joint nut loose. I'm not going to completely remove it yet because then the steering knuckle would drop. So those three things: remove or take loose the lower stabilizer fork, remove the wheel speed sensor, and take loose the ball joint, and then I'll do another update after I've completed those things. Okay, so I got the speed sensor removed, I got the strut fork top and bottom bolts removed, and then I removed the strut fork, and then I loosened the nut on the upper ball joint, and then popped the ball joint shaft free from the steering knuckle, and I'll describe those processes. So this is the strut fork. The top section actually clamps around the lower strut tube. It's just a pinch bolt, so I used an impact to remove it. You do have to back it all the way out to get it off of the lower strut tube, because there's a little recessed section that the bolt sits in, kind of cradles in on the lower strut tube. On the bottom end, there's a damper set up on the head of the bolt, and then the nut actually has a tab welded to it, and when the nut is fully tightened, this tab is squeezed forward and locks against the strut fork to prevent the nut from working free from the bolt while you're driving down the road. If that happened, it could cause the collapse of your strut assembly, sending your wheel up into your inner fender. On the ball joint, I took the nut all the way off, and everything kind of stays in place when you first take the nut off. The shaft is stuck in the steering knuckle, so it won't drop down. So I took the nut off, I sprayed the threads with some WD-40, put the nut back on, and then you strike this surface. There's a little nub right here, which is a striking surface on the upper steering knuckle, and if you hit that with a downward motion, sometimes that will pop the steering knuckle free from the ball joint shaft. If that's not working, sometimes I'll alternate between, I'll thread the nut up as far as I can, preferably exactly flush with the bottom of the shaft threads, because then you can strike straight up on this with no risk of damaging the threads on the shaft, and no or little risk of rolling the nut over into the thread surface, because you don't want to damage either of those items. So if you thread it exactly flush, then you can alternate your blows between straight up on the nut surface and then down on the strike surface, and eventually this will pop free. They also make a tool, a press for popping this free, but I don't have one, and renting one is kind of unnecessary when you can pop it free with force without damaging anything. And then so the final item was the wheel speed sensor. It mounts on the back of the steering knuckle behind the rotor. It's got one bolt that holds it to the steering knuckle, and then it's got a small plastic locating dowel, and this is usually stuck pretty good. It fits snugly in a drilled hole in the steering knuckle. So once you get the bolt out, you have to rock this back and forth along the axis of the locating dowel slowly and carefully until you get it free enough that you can slowly walk it out. If you try and just pry it out, you'll break the plastic locating dowel off every time. Spraying this will help, and then to initially get it moving, you can use a ratchet handle or whatever you can get in between the body here and the steering knuckle to begin rocking it, as long as you're careful that the force you apply is perpendicular to the axis that the locating dowel is on. So you just work that back and forth until it comes out. So we've got the speed sensor out of the way, we've got the lower strut fork removed, and we've got this nut popped free. So you want to put we've got the ball joint popped free. You want to put the nut back on before the steering knuckle pops free from the ball joint shaft, or this whole thing will come crashing down. So now we're ready to remove the nut here that holds the CV shaft into the steering knuckle assembly. It's 32 millimeter, or an 1.25 inch socket will also work. It's going to be a job for an impact. If you're doing this process without an impact, it's going to be difficult. There's a little tab on the CV nut that is folded in to a notch in the CV shaft, so that has to be peeled back before you can take the nut off. This was probably a screwdriver at one time. At this point, it's just been ground down to a point like a punch. It needs to be, if you're going to use a punch, it needs to have kind of a fine point. A nail would also work. If you stuck a nail in a pair of vice grips, that would probably work. You're going to have to, whatever you're using needs a strike surface so that you can hammer in here and pry this little tab out. Slowly and carefully work that little tab out so you can get the nut off. So I'm going to take the nut off of the CV shaft, and I'm going to take the cotter pin out and the nut off of the tie rod end that runs into your steering rack. And then it's a similar process to free this ball joint in this tie rod end as it is to free the shaft from the top of your steering knuckle. I'm going to spray it with WD-40, run the nut up flush with the top of the threads on the shaft, and then there's a strike surface here. I'll alternate between striking the strike surface and the top of the nut. You don't want to hammer towards the rack. If you hit this towards the car with a hammer, you're going to send the impact force into your steering rack, which would not be a good thing to do. That'd be a good way to destroy your steering rack. So if you strike this steering knuckle, you want to make sure you're going in the direction of the front of the car. And then once the nut is backed up to the top of the threads, I'll hammer down, and that'll pop that free. So I'll take this, I'll take the tie rod end free. I'll take the nut off of the CV shaft. At that point, I'm going to put a floor jack underneath the steering knuckle to support it. I'll actually jack it up slightly to take the tension off. Then I'm going to remove this nut up top, and at that point, when I let the floor jack down slightly, it will allow the upper steering knuckle to come free from the upper ball joint. And then, if you're fortunate enough to have your CV shaft splines be free in your steering knuckle, you can simply pull the steering knuckle away from the CV shaft and push the CV shaft back towards into the car and separate the two. This is probably going to be more difficult than that. My splines are probably going to be somewhat frozen into the steering knuckle, but I'll cross that bridge when I get there. So I'll do another update after I get those three things done. Disconnect the tie rod end, remove the CV shaft nut, and drop the steering knuckle assembly down with a floor jack. Okay, I removed the tie rod end from the steering knuckle, and then I used an 1¼ inch socket and an impact to remove the CV shaft nut, and then I brought over a floor jack and supported the steering knuckle and took the nut off of the upper ball joint, and then lowered the floor jack enough that I could detach, remove the ball joint shaft from the upper steering knuckle arm, and then that allows the whole assembly to come forward. You want to be careful not to overstretch the brake line, but that didn't seem to be an issue. My CV shaft was stuck due to corrosion in the steering knuckle and rotor assembly. I was fortunate enough to have a press. It just fastens with the lug nuts to the rotor, and then you can use an impact to thread this in, and that will force the CV shaft back out. There's enough play in the CV shaft that, especially with this steering knuckle assembly free from the upper ball joint, you can just push the CV shaft out. If you don't have one of these, consider renting one. If you can't get one, if you're not going to reuse the CV shaft, if you've got a replacement, you can use a drift and a hammer and just work the CV shaft back that way with force. The risk to the CV shaft is that you can actually mushroom out the threaded end of the CV shaft that goes into the steering knuckle, and the problem that causes is when you go to put the CV shaft nut back on, it won't go. Again, if you're replacing the CV shaft, you don't have to worry about that. If you are reusing the CV shaft and you can't get the press, it's still possible to do it this way. You just be more careful. If you do end up mushrooming the end of the CV shaft, you could file or grind off the mushroomed end of the CV shaft, because there's no threads on the end anyway, and potentially reuse it. Also, you can use a chisel behind the steering knuckle and actually wedge in between the outer bearing case of the CV shaft and the back surface of the steering knuckle, and between front blows and the force of the wedge, you can force it out that way without damaging the CV shaft beyond reuse. But again, ideally, using a press is the best way to get the stuck shaft out. So I went ahead and removed the CV shaft from the transmission. This is the passenger side of the car. This is the shaft end that goes into the transmission on the passenger side of the car. This is the shaft end that goes into the transmission on the driver's side of the car. There's a difference. This end has a snap ring, and then this is the driver's side, has a snap ring in the transmission. The passenger side does not have a snap ring. What keeps this the passenger side CV shaft seated in the transmission is actually this bearing housing and bracket. So there's a bearing inside this that allows this bracket to spin, and this bracket bolts to a bracket on the engine block. So to remove the shaft on the passenger side, you have to take two 13mm nuts off of this bracket, and then just maneuver this housing as you pull the shaft out, and this end slides right out of the transmission. On the driver's side, because of the snap ring, the best method is actually to get a pry bar. The transmission housing goes right up to within a 1/4 inch of this bearing housing on the CV shaft. So if you just get a pry bar and get in between this and the transmission housing, you can force this out. No hammering involved, just steady force, and the snap ring will pop out of the groove inside the transmission, and then again this shaft just slides out. Installation is just the reverse procedure for removal. So on this side, if you're starting with a new shaft, or if you're reusing your old shaft, you guide it in, install this end into the transmission, guide these bracket holes over the bolts on the bracket that's on the engine block, put your nuts on, tighten them down, and then you'd guide the other end into the steering knuckle assembly by lowering the steering knuckle again. And then it all just goes back together one step at a time in reverse of how we took it apart. And that's the process for CV shaft removal and replacement on 2003 to 2008 Mazda 6 with the 3.0 Duratec.